Welcome to the IVM Podcast Network.
Do you have rights over your own data? What are we signing up for every time we download a new app? What's really going on at the India-China border? We'll speak about all of this and more on this episode of the Pragati Podcast. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast. My name is Hamsini Hariharan, and every fortnight on the show we discuss economics, politics and policy. My co-host Pawan Srinath is off on vacation for the next couple of weeks and I'm incredibly jealous. But today's episode is about an exciting bunch of things. In the first half, I'm going to sit down with Rahul Mattan, a partner at Trilegal, and Takshashila lawyer Mansa Venkatraman to talk about data protection. In the second half of the show, Nitin Pai joins me to talk about the current border standoff between India and China. Over the last 2 weeks, the Supreme Court was deciding on whether we have the right to privacy under the Constitution. Privacy is even more important in today's day and age, where you submit your information to every website, every app, and every device. India still needs a framework for data protection. Accepting the terms and conditions on an app simply doesn't cut it anymore. We need someone to give us a skeleton of how a data protection law would work like. So here's where my guests for today step in. Rahul Mattan is a partner at Trilegal and a fellow at the Technology and Policy Program at the Takshashila Institution. Rahul has proposed a framework on which a possible data protection law should be based. Mansa Venkatraman is a lawyer and a research associate at the Takshashila Institution. Mansa, Rahul, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. Okay, so Mansa, let's start off with you. Can you tell me why we need a new law for data protection?
Yeah, we have nothing right now. We're just making do with the bare minimum. When we try to download an app from the App Store and when we sign up for some terms and conditions, what we're actually signing up for is dense legalese, which we don't always understand. We don't know how much of our data we're sharing with the people who want to collect it, with the social networking site or with a shopping app. I don't know what remedies I have if my data is misused. I don't know how securely they're processed by the persons collecting our data, which is why it's really important to have a law that sets all of this out right from scratch. And maybe it's a good thing that we don't have anything yet because we can build something up from scratch. And that's where I think Rahul's model becomes important. I think, Rahul, the three principles that underline the new data protection model are autonomy, accountability, and security. Could you tell us a little more about why it's these principles that are the pillars?
So, I think it's probably important to start with the pillar which is not there, and I guess that's the big thing about the model that I'm suggesting, which is models around the world are based on consent, and consent is undeniably broken.
Yeah.
We give consent without fully understanding it, as Mansa just said. We've got dense legalese. But it's just the way in which technology works today. It's impossible even for the smartest person to understand what giving that consent actually means and what harms it can cause. And so the first principle, I think, that a new model privacy law should be based on is not consent, which is a prior consent and given to a person who collects your data or uses your data. And then after that person can do pretty much what they want with that data because you've given consent. Instead, they should be held accountable for what they do with the data. And so the first principle really is accountability. So regardless of the consent that you've provided or not provided, or the consent that you provided, which because of the legalese you didn't understand the extent to which it invades your privacy, the person who has collected your data has to be accountable for the harm that he causes you or it causes you. And the model prescribes that as the fundamental basis. I think the second element is autonomy. And if you look back to the reason for consent, it's based on the principle of autonomy, that we must have the ability to do what we want with our own data, because that is the essence of privacy. One person's privacy is not another person's privacy. And so I want the ability to decide whether I disclose the information or not. Now, in a world where that information is being taken from you in ways that you can't understand, I think the thing that you absolutely must be guaranteed is the ability to prevent someone from using your data if they've collected it from you. So, the first principle is accountability. So if they've got it and they do you any harm, they're accountable for the harm. The second principle is that if you so choose, you can tell them, I don't want you doing anything with my data from this point on, regardless of whether you've done me harm or not, regardless of if anything happens. It's my autonomy to decide to prevent you from continuing to use the data. And then the third principle, which actually is nothing new, is security, because we need to impose upon collectors and processors of data the obligation to ensure that the data is maintained securely. I think all the other principles do actually speak towards that, but it is important to really mandate it. And I think whatever the law that comes out of this says, it needs to have some sort of dynamic mechanism to ensure that security is maintained, and that as technology improves, as the nature of the data that we collect changes, we keep changing those principles such that regardless of the form in which the data is collected and used, it always remains secure.
All right. So when you're talking about accountability or autonomy or security, these principles are already existing, right? Why are they salient now?
Well, I think it's questionable whether accountability exists. It is being introduced into the law in Europe. I guess it certainly does exist, but I think the overemphasis on consent as the means to ensure personal privacy is, in some ways, detracts from the effectiveness of an accountability principle. In that you can always say that you gave me consent, and so in some way have a diminished accountability for what you do. If you've collected information from someone, that person has allowed you to collect it and allowed you to use it for a list of purposes, you can always go back to them and say, you knew I was going to use it for this, and so why are you now telling me I'm accountable for the harm? You knew that this was a harm that could result out of this. And what I'm trying to say is that regardless of that consent, regardless of whatever I may have said in the privacy policy, which, quite frankly, all of us sign up to these privacy policies every day, and not one of us, even the lawyers in this room, have read all of them. And so we end up signing up to things that can later be held against us to say, look, I'm not accountable for the harm that I've caused because you've actually signed up to this. And that's really the fundamental shift, in a sense. And once again, I don't want to claim that this is a brand new idea. This is many people around the world have thought along these lines. But I think what's different in India, and Mansa also mentioned that, is that we actually don't have a privacy law. All the other countries that used consent as the model have now got a lot of baggage of consent, maybe 4 decades worth of baggage. They are recognizing that consent is sort of coming in the way. They are now trying to add on an accountability piece, but they can't eliminate consent completely. And what I suggest is that we completely eliminate it. We retain the principle of autonomy, but don't let consent come in the way of accountability, which it is doing in other countries in the world.
All right.
So Rahul, you mentioned two interesting things. One is that we don't have a law for privacy and also for data privacy. Over the last couple of days, the Supreme Court has, while it's been hearing this right to privacy matter before it made, I think Chandrachud made an interesting statement. He said that irrespective of how they decide whether the right to privacy, how the right to privacy is read into the Constitution, you need a separate law for data protection in any case. So I think it's good that the courts have already understood the distinction between the two. But could you throw some light on that?
So the right to privacy is a really interesting case, but I think only from the sort of technical perspective that us lawyers really appreciate, because we've got 2 Supreme Court decisions from many years ago, which contradict each other on the face of it. And the pedantic lawyers want a clear definition from the Supreme Court that, in fact, there is a right to privacy. But what we forget is, in the 40 years that have followed these decisions, there have been numerous decisions where the court has basically worked on the premise that there is an implicit right to privacy. So there's no denying the fact that there is no fundamental right to privacy in that it's not written into the Constitution, because if it was, we'd be reading it, and there isn't anything. But over the years, in the context of HIV/AIDS, in the context of marital privacy, we've just worked on the presumption that there is such a thing. But if you want to appreciate the real point that Chandrachud is making, the right to privacy guarantees you a right against the violation of your privacy by the state, and by some extension, certain large state-like actors. But what a data protection law needs to do is much larger. And it is not possible for the Supreme Court, by setting out that we have a right to privacy, to deal with all those various things that we want to deal with. So, for instance, just the things we're talking about, right? Accountability, autonomy, data security, and just all the mechanisms that go into this. We also need to have an enforcement agency, because as people are saying, data is the new currency. Some people are saying, data is the new electricity. It is going to power everything that we do. And you can't just have one line in the Constitution to say that you have a right to it. You've got to have a lot more detail. And if you look at Europe as an example, they've spent 5 years trying to get this new European data protection regulation out. It's a complicated thing. There are and also technology keeps changing, so we've got to keep coming up with new technology, new plugs for the new technology advances, and you can't do that just relying on the Supreme Court to guarantee you a right to privacy.
All right, fair enough. So we've been talking about a lot of things about, the harm that can be caused in terms of the violation of your privacy, right? Can you give me some examples of how this will be done? So, for example, if I'm using a health tracking app, to which I give it how many footsteps I take in a day, my cholesterol rate, my blood pressure, my heartbeat, how does it matter?
So, look, it's actually difficult to explain these things in isolation, because the real problem with data today is none of these data sets exist in isolation. So your health tracking app, which you strap onto your wrist or on a band across your chest, will measure your heart rate, will measure the vigorous manner in which you flail your arms, and will come to some assumptions as to the amount of activity that you're doing. That of itself is not as useful to you as if you add to that GPS data, which tells you where you walk. Then, since it's always on, it will also tell you when you slept and when you woke up. It'll once you got GPS location, which is always on, it'll tell you where exactly you went on your way back from work. And when you overlay all of that with financial information, where it'll add on your spending habits, you'll start getting a very deep and accurate profile of yourself. And it's when these kinds of profiles get built that various types of harm can be caused to you. There can be reputational harm just because of that activity indicates that you are doing certain things that you, in your position as a respectable businessman, should not be doing. And you can imagine how you could correlate all of that information if someone has all this information and overlays it on a map to come up with all sorts of conclusions about that could affect your reputation. There are many other harms, like I guess the most obvious harm is financial harm, and financial harm is unlikely to be caused out of a fitness tracker. But even so, once you start overlaying all these levels of data, even that could occur.
All right.
It is quite surprising that we don't have any law talking about data transfers right now. A lot of the apps and the websites that collect our data, social networking sites, shopping apps, transfer it amongst themselves. So data is, in a sense, interconnected. What do you have in mind? What should the law look like when it talks about data transfers?
So I've tried to subsume all of that into the accountability principle, in that if you collect my data and if you transfer it to some other person, and as a result of that transfer, you cause me harm. Or rather, if you transfer it in a insecure manner, or if you transfer it in a manner which is not anonymized sufficiently enough for people not to actually track all the way back to me and then do me harm, then you will be accountable for whatever harm arises, even as a result of that transfer. So I'm hoping that with this model, people who have data, you've got to, you can't get me wrong. I'm all for data moving wherever it has to move, because data in an aggregate form is actually very, very useful to us. So we've got to allow the transfers, but we've got to allow safe transfers, so that if you transfer the data, the person who receives the data can't overlay that data with something else that they have and then come up with this deep personal profile of you that could cause you harm. I think one of the other tenets of this is that the consent model assumes that we have the ability to take these decisions. Actually, it's the data controller and the data processor who has a much better ability to take these decisions, because they're the ones who are holding the data. They know how the data is being used, when it is exactly used. And so I think we need to shift the burden onto the data controllers to say, look, you're the controller of my data. You're not transferring this data to some other person. I really don't know the checks and balances that you've put in place, but if you haven't put enough checks and balances in place, I'm going to hold you accountable for it. And I think that's sort of the shift that this model suggests, so that we don't rely over much on the consent side of things, but equally continue to put pressure on the controllers and the processors to make them accountable for every subsequent action that they do with the data that could potentially cause me harm.
How will the data controllers be supervised, though? And for instance, if there is any bias already in the data when they're collecting it. So for instance, a bank collects information about possible loan applicants, and it uses their gender or their religion as an ingredient for determining whether they will be granted a loan. This is clearly a bias. What is a mechanism that will check this bias?
So you've got to have some sort of regulatory mechanism. And I think the challenge with a regulatory mechanism in this world is that it is actually a technically complex world. And so the regulator actually needs to understand the way data science works in order for us to have an effective regulator. So the model actually goes into some detail on how we build up such a regulatory model. One of the suggestions is to have a learned intermediary, and the concept behind the learned intermediary is someone who is skilled in data science, who understands the way these sorts of algorithms work. You know, a lot of the algorithms currently use deep learning, machine learning, the artificial intelligence, and all of these things tend to work within black boxes. So if you actually run vast amounts of data through a machine learning algorithm, you don't know how exactly that machine learning algorithm decides that we're going to give weightage to gender, or we're going to give weightage to something else, but it does, and it comes up with some outputs. And you only have the opportunity to check whether the output is biased when the output comes out, and that's often too late. And so the model suggests that we use people who have some sort of data science background to actually check the output on the margin. And by that I mean, as the data is being fed through the algorithm, there needs to be a mechanism whereby the auditor or the learned intermediary is checking the output soon enough so that they can add noise either at the input or the output level to correct any bias that comes in to the output. And that's just one of the models. There are also suggestions to use open source algorithms, and I think the easiest fix is if someone's actually searching the database. If the bank is searching the database for women, that's sort of that's an obvious bias, and so there should be some sort of a check on the types of queries that you apply to the database to ensure that those queries don't end up giving a biased result.
All right, so something that I've been wondering is we spoke about how this will affect controllers, but I'm wondering about other stakeholders. How does it affect consumers? How does it affect companies? How do they react to it?
So look, consumers, I'm hoping, I think there's this concern around autonomy, and I think that's the reason why consumers do want to have that ability to give their consent before data is collected. But I think on the balance, given the fact that it is so difficult to pass these long privacy policies and legal terms and conditions, the consumer is actually better off if he can hold the data controller accountable, even though he's given consent or even though he's agreed to the data being collected. I think as far as companies are concerned, you'd be surprised how much importance companies give to ensuring that they are accountable to good data protection practices. Now, there have been many instances where there have been data breaches. There have been many instances where, even in India, you've got examples of companies, even very recently, that have allowed data to leak. But if you can see the sort of public backlash that comes as a result of this, not just here, but anywhere in the world, there is a huge reputational risk to not adopting the highest data security and data protection standards. And so companies do invest a lot in actually ensuring that is the case. So I think by making them explicitly accountable, you do put a little more pressure on the company because it now has a financial implication to them, to their business. And also they can no longer hide behind the shield of consent that they could. But I don't believe that it is that much more pressure than what they already face, given that the backlash that they will receive reputationally as a result of this is quite significant. So I think it's if you ask me, I think companies would be quite happy with this model.
All right. Thank you so much, Rahul and Mansa, for joining me on this podcast. Let's hope that we get a Data Protection Act soon. That's it for the first half of the Pragati podcast. We'll be back in the second half with Nitin Pai talking about the standoff between India and China.
Hi, I'm Ambika.
And I'm Hoshna.
Come journey with us around India as we chat about new and offbeat destinations, from secret islands to village stays, give you travel tips and advice, discuss all the yummy and weird food we've sampled, and induce some serious wanderlust.
So tune in to the Rediscovery podcast.
New episodes out every Monday on the IVM podcast app or any other podcasting app you like.
Welcome back to the Pragati podcast. For the last month, we've been hearing reports about our border guards standing eyeball to eyeball across the Indian-Chinese border. So today on the Pragati podcast, I have Nitin Pai with me. Welcome back to the show, Nitin.
I am Sunny.
Nitin needs no introduction, and this has been something that he feels very strongly about. So I thought let's dive straight into the issue and talk about what exactly is the problem between India and China along the border. There is a lot of confusion about where the dispute is taking place, where the troops are clashing, and there are many narratives flying around. So can you tell us whether it's happening at the plateau or the pass or the tri-junction and what this even means?
Okay, I think before we even go into understanding the exact geography of what's happening now, I think we should understand why there is a border or a boundary dispute between India and China. Historically, both India and China were large civilization states, and they shared a common frontier in the form of the Himalayas. And now, because the Himalayas were so high and impermeable, the two civilizations had very sporadic direct contact. So, in the military sense. So there was one invasion of India which happened just right after the time of Xuanzang going back to China, right after a high in India-China relations. And since that time, that was in 548 AD. And after that, the next big invasion was in 1962, right, when the Chinese PLA came down the slopes into Indian territory. Now, for over 2,000 years, the Himalayas have been a huge strategic frontier between these two large civilization states and have kept the peace among two very, very, very different thinking civilizations. The Chinese way of looking at the world is very different from the Indian way of looking at the world. And the disparity has been kept at bay because of the Himalayas. Now, once the 19th and the 20th century happened, technology and politics and political mores of the world took over. For example, the Himalayas were first time permeable to large numbers of people moving across. So technology had taken, and in the 20th century, of course, you could fly over the Himalayas. You could move large numbers of people across the Himalayas. That's one. The second is the modern concept of a nation state with firm boundaries is only about 100 plus years old, maybe 150 years old in this part of in the world. So suddenly in history, for the first time in, let's say, 1947, 1950, India and China were required to have a border. Earlier we had frontiers, we had zones of separation between the two nation states or civilization states. For the first time we needed to have a border. And we need to have a border in a place which is really some of the most remote landscape in the world. And nobody used to walk around there. Very, very infrequent human communication in those areas. Very few settlements. So large parts of those borders were indeterminate. So we knew that the Himalayas were frontiers, but exactly which part of which mountain and which valley or which watershed is the exact boundary between India and China, nobody knew. And to a large extent, nobody knows even to this day. So it is indeterminate. Now what we're trying to do is we're trying to put political boundaries, geometrically aligned political boundaries in a system which did not understand this for several thousand years. And it's extremely difficult to do it because of the terrain. So that's the genesis of the problem. Now, for various reasons, historically, mistakes were made on both sides by the Chinese as well as by the Indians, which resulted in us not being able to demarcate or, have a firm decision on what this border ought to be. Right, or the border is. So there are these conversations going on for many 2 or 3 decades now, which try to come to an arrangement what the border is. Now, until that time, that thing is settled, the border is live, the boundary is live, which means it creates political constituencies for diplomacy, for trade, for coercion, for cooperation to happen. And now what we are seeing on the India-Sikkim Bhutan, China tri-junction is a manifestation of that. It's an incident which is now, in itself, is probably not that significant, but is become a platform for a larger drama about India-China relations.
Fair enough. Both sides have gone about saying, historically the borders were different. But what you're saying is that historically there were no demarcations, right?
Historically there were no borders. Historically we had frontiers, right? Now, the Chinese and the Bhutanese have been able to solve some of the China-Bhutan border issues. In some places, it's not all solved. There are 3 or 4 areas where still it's unresolved. Now, what's happened? Let's bring it to the current context. The backstory to the current context starts somewhere about 2002 and 3, when the Chinese PLA makes incursions into territory which was disputed between China and Bhutan. And Bhutan, being a small country and much, much weaker compared to China, could not really raise much of a fuss when this happened. So 2002 to 2007, the Chinese PLA came down the slope, built mud roads, which they could use. They used to patrol this place very often. So this was happening in the first 10 years of this millennium.
Fair enough. So you're saying incursions are not new.
Incursions are not new, and what the Chinese did in basically encroaching or changing the status quo of territory which they had in dispute with Bhutan. This was happening from around 2003 onwards. Now, what is new in this case is when this continued and there was a fresh round of Chinese attempts to change the status quo by building a road, the Indian army got involved. Now, it is not clear to me whether the Indian army moved on its own accord or in consultation with Bhutan. The government of India says it was after Bhutan requested it. But it's quite possible that the Indian army moved on its own volition and decided that the Chinese have taken a step too far and they're not going to allow a similar incursion or an extension of the incursion which happened in, let's say, 2004 and 5 to happen again in 2017. It's important to realize that the Indian army went into territory which is disputed between Bhutan and China. It is not territory which is disputed between India and China. According to Bhutanese and according to us, it's Bhutanese territory. The Chinese sort of disagree with that. So what got the Chinese government's goat was the fact that India intervened in a third country against China. It would have been very different for them, I guess, if it was just an India-China direct kind of a confrontation. This was India intervening on behalf of a third country called Bhutan. Now, it's another story that India and Bhutan have a very unique relationship, where for most of the last 50 years or more, Bhutanese external relations were managed by India. But it still is a sovereign state, and India respects its sovereignty, so does China. So it makes it a slightly different kind of a situation.
All right, but now neither countries are backing off, right? The standoff's been going on for most of this month. Why won't they de-escalate, or will this lead to war on Kororli?
The chances of a peaceful, amicable de-escalation were ruled out the moment China made public its demand that India withdraw, without which there won't be diplomacy. In other words, they said withdrawal is a condition for diplomacy, which immediately means that this situation is not conducive for diplomacy. Diplomacy is the art of asking what the other person can give, or the art of not asking what the other person cannot give. Now, if you've created a situation, your demand is such that the only way diplomacy can happen is for India to turn tail and say, look, we're going to withdraw, we are sorry. In order to make India look like a loser, before diplomacy can start, it's a non-starter. So the imposition of a condition which India could not satisfy was the reason why diplomacy has failed in this situation. In that sense, this is the second Chinese error, or the second Chinese mistake. The first mistake was encroaching into territory which was disputed. The second mistake was to get onto this extremely belligerent rhetorical position which says that only if the Indian army withdraws will we be ready to talk, which has now gotten themselves into a situation where if they were to be seen as having a conversation with India about this, they'll be seen as a climb down and a loss of face for the Chinese. But they are to be blamed for their own predicament. Okay, so what are the chances of escalation in this case? The escalation depends entirely on China, because I think the Indian position has been clear that the Indian position is that you will not build this road. We are not going to escalate the situation ourselves. We're just going to hold this line. And only option for you is to step back. We could mutually withdraw from our positions. In case it's a mutual stepping back, but there's no unilateral stepping back. Now, the China has said that, issued all sorts of dire warnings directly and indirectly. And, there have been strong rhetoric, there have been military exercises, testing of a tank. All of these, actions appear to be creating a psychology of scaring or bullying India into submission. And to the extent that India does not submit to this kind of bullying, it's for the Chinese to decide how much they want to escalate. All right, and all of this has to be sorted before September when the snows set in, right? Well, yes. The weather is going to provide a sort of a timer to this whole standoff, this particular standoff, because after a period, it will probably be very hard for both sides to sustain any kind of a presence there. It might be harder for the Chinese to sustain a presence there despite their better infrastructure, because the weather on their side might be harsher than the Indian side. But even so, both parties will find it extremely hard to sustain beyond the month of September, maybe early October. And that's when weather will force a sort of a mutual withdrawal on both sides. Okay, Nitin, can you place this in a larger context for me? What does this mean for India-China relations? Because, incursion, standoff, that's still something we see as a little more common. The larger context is one where the Chinese leadership sees the People's Republic of China ascending to a global leadership position and challenging and probably toppling the United States from its number one position. They have set themselves targets for as early as 2021 to achieve this kind of a number one position. And in doing so, not only is it that the Chinese government sees itself as taking up the leadership position, it sees itself as changing the norms of international relations. It's changing norms of international order. Here, I think the model on which they're patterning their contemporary behavior is that of the traditional Middle Kingdom, where the Chinese state the Emperor of China was seen as having the mandate from heaven to be the sole sovereign of the world, of the civilized world, and every other country or people were either tributaries or barbarians. Right?
Tianxia.
So, Tianxia. The Tianxia kind of a concept which says everything under heaven, the civilized part of the world is governed by the Chinese Middle Kingdom, and you have tributaries who are in awe of the Chinese Empire and pay tribute to the Chinese Emperor, or you have barbarians who are further away and who need to be civilized or who need to be fought with. So, now this is a classical stylized view of the world. Now, to what extent this animates Chinese foreign policy in the 21st century remains to be seen. But both in terms of what many Chinese scholars say and what we can discern from the People's Republic of China's behavior in the last 10 years, you could see that this is a kind of blueprint they have on which they're constructing the edifice of their 21st century international order. There might be changes to accommodate for modernity and all that, but at the base of which this is what you've seen. And this is what I think comes out very clearly in China's treatment of Japan over the Ryukyu Islands, or with China's engagement of India, as we can see with this particular case, to say that we make the rules and we will get you to comply according to the rules and the norms that we set. We can make claims, for example, in the South China Sea with the 9 dashed lines and say this is, historically this has been our territory. Or you could claim a similar kind of a frontier on the Himalayan frontiers to say that this is our territory.
So what should India do? What are India's policy options? What can we do at this moment?
Well, for a long time, I've been arguing that it is quite pointless to complain about China's overreach in India's neighborhood, China's engagement of India's neighbors, or even China's encroachment in the Himalayan frontiers. What I've been arguing is that India should play a stronger role in East Asia, in the South China Sea and the Sea of Japan, in the Western Pacific in general, where there is a very important role India can play by balancing affecting the balance of power in that region in such a way that there is internationalism and international order as we know it prevails. China is trying to change that. In that part of the world, there are countries like Japan, Vietnam, South Korea, Australia, and the United States, just to name a few, and Singapore, whose interest it is for India to be a partner in order to balance rising Chinese power there and let international order prevail. Now, to the extent that we can do this successfully and credibly, China will realize that it is not as wise to play a role in India's neighborhood as it is doing right now. So in other words, it's like you don't scratch my back and I don't scratch your back. Or, if you don't poke me here, I won't poke you there kind of a system. I think that's far better to achieve a balance between India and China than to focus exclusively on the Himalayan frontier. Because we don't want to militarize a frontier. It's not in our interest to militarize a frontier. It is not in our interest to have standoffs like the current one which we have with China. So to the extent that we can minimize that by pushing the focus away from the Himalayan border onto the Pacific Ocean, it's good for us. It means we have to think very differently. We can't think like a continental power. We have to think like a maritime power. We have to be able to understand maritime power projection. We have to be able to invest more in naval assets, missile assets and air assets to some extent, and to be able to do this on a sustained basis so that we can affect the balance of power in the Indian Ocean in general, Western Pacific in particular.
All right. So to prevent border clashes, we need to stop thinking like a continental power. Thanks, Nitin. That's it for this episode of the Pragati Podcast. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts from. And of course, on thinkpragati.com.
एक्सक्यूज मी भैया, एक्सक्यूज मी.
बोलिए मैडम.
मेन्यू में क्या है?
मेन्यू में सीन अनसीन है, पॉडकास्ट है, ऑन कोर्स है, साइरस है, मेड इन इंडिया, रीडिस्कवरी प्रोजेक्ट, एम्पावरिंग सीरीज, सेक्स वैक्स है, IVM लाइक्स है, सिंप्लीफाइड है, कीपिंग इट क्वियर है, थिंग्स एंड डेस्टिनेशंस है, माय नेबर जकरबर्ग है और द फन गराज है. आपको क्या चाहिए?
एक बार रिपीट कर देंगे क्या?
रिपीट नहीं करता हम. आप जाओ IVMpodcast.com पे और सुनो ये सब, या फिर डाउनलोड करो उनका ऐप, सब आपकी उंगलियों पे.